Test. There we go. Afternoon, everybody. Wow, it's a very exciting conference we got going here. Yeah. Well, everybody's playing with their Surfaces, not paying attention. Is that? Oh, let's try that again. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Much better. Welcome to Windows Azure Virtual Machines and Virtual Networks. My name is Mark Rasinovich. I'm really pleased to see the room so full. I'm not talking about Windows internals, by the way, just in case you came to the wrong session by accident or thought that I was going to talk about it. I'm talking about Windows Azure. Just to get a flavor for the composition of the room, how many people have never heard of Windows Azure before? See, that's much better than about a year ago. How many people have played with Windows Azure? How many people have deployed a virtual machine on Windows Azure? How many people have deployed a virtual machine at all, ever, anywhere? Okay, just wanted everybody to raise their hand. So this session is a 60-minute quick overview of a bunch of features that we released in June that include virtual machines. I'm going to talk about how virtual machines fits into the overall Windows Azure story, as well as the virtual network enhancements that we made that are applicable not just to virtual machines, but cloud services, but really enable a whole bunch of virtual machine scenarios. And before I dig in, I just wanted to jump in and show you what creating a virtual machine is like in Windows Azure. If you haven't done it before, it's actually very simple. And we're going to go to the new portal. We still call this the new portal since the old portal was around for a few years, and the new portal's been around since about June, and you can see that it's, can you see it? All right, this is my first time to present off Office 2013, and I'm still figuring out. I don't want to do end show. Huh. All right, I think I need to do display settings, swap. Oh, sorry about the hide presenter view there, because it's giving me this artificial view of things. There we go. All right, so